Well, serfdom is understood as the status of the peasants, the people who are actually working on land in medieval England and indeed other periods in history, but we're thinking particularly today about the Middle Ages. This means the obligations that peasants owe to their lords. It means their status in terms of what they have to do, what powers they do and especially do not have. It's related to the question of whether they are free or whether they are slaves. And indeed, the word serf is derived from servus, which means a slave in Latin and in related languages. So serfdom is looking at this phenomenon. What obligations and duties peasants owe to their masters. Serfdom is, for instance, if you lived in a village and you were required to work 2 days a week on the land of your lord as well as your own land, that would be an example of an obligation. That's the sort of thing that serfdom involves. And what I find particularly interesting is the development of these obligations and the role of Paul Vinogradov and Frederick Maitland in how that understanding came together. Vinogradov was a Russian scholar. He was born in the 1850s and he was raised at a time of immense social change in Russia when the status of the Russian peasants was going through quite radical transformation. And so he saw this going on around him and had that change in mind when he came to England in the 1880s and took a look at what proved to be very, very rich records in various English archives. And so he came to these with a vision for how you could understand the changing relationship between peasants and their lords. Vinogradov was very interested in the idea that these requirements, these pressures that were being put on the peasantry came from above, that this was a situation that had very consciously been created. It was not something that had been there since time immemorial. So he created this view of serfdom, which portrayed it as a creation of the Middle Ages. It was something that came in largely after the Norman conquest and grew in complexity and intensity as one moved through the 12th and 13th centuries. And going further back, he believed that there had been continuities, but that those lay in different areas. Those lay in how groups associate with one another, not necessarily how hierarchies worked with each other. He saw those two things working sometimes together, but more often in opposition to one another. So he was trying to create something quite different, something quite new. And his relationship with Maitland was founded on that change, that quite fundamental change in the way that scholars were starting to look at the way the peasantry, the countryside and serfdom worked in England in the Middle Ages. There was a vast quantity of records available in English archives from the whole Middle Ages, well, at least from the later Middle Ages. And these told you about how individual farms, individual villages, individual lords had operated their property, had handled the rights and obligations of the peasantry. And these had been known for a long time, but scholars had not tapped them for that particular kind of inquiry. And so Vinogradov had sort of cut his teeth doing this kind of work in Italy, in Germany, and came to England for the first time in 1883, and he was just blown away by all of this material that he found. He thought, gosh, this lets you really, really plumb the depths in a way that you can't do in most places for the Middle Ages. And he was so impressed by this that one day in January 1884, when he was out for a walk in the countryside, along with a whole group of scholars and intellectuals from London and Oxford and Cambridge. And on this trip, he got talking with another young scholar called Frederick Maitland, who was interested in some of the same questions, some of the same issues. Maitland in particular was interested in law. He was interested in customs, how society organized itself, what rules people imposed to keep things running. And Maitland and Vinogradov discovered that they'd been working on parallel lines, that they were asking some of the same questions. And so they developed a correspondence. They were in regular communication with each other, trying to see where each other was going in terms of their research. So Maitland and Vinogradov began this correspondence, wrote to each other regularly in the first half of 1884, and then one day they arranged to meet in Oxford, and they had a great time, and they ended up going out and sitting in the park together. And as they were sitting there, Vinogradov just laid out in enormously expansive detail just how much there was to be done based on rural records in England. And Maitland, the very next day, went to the Public Records Office in London and called up some of these records, and he too realised just how correct Vinogradov had been, just how much material there was here for him to use, which he did indeed use in his scholarship over the next few years. And so these two scholars, working side by side, working very closely with each other, helped transform various aspects of the subject. Vinogradov himself focused on the what he called villanage. This is another way of understanding serfdom. This is another term for the peasants and different statuses they had and what that meant in terms of what they owed to their lords. He expanded, elaborated this idea that villanage, as he understood it, serfdom as he understood it, was a product of the post-conquest period after 1066. He tried to trace how it had evolved in Norman England. In subsequent years, that book was published in the 1880s, first in Russian, then in English, but in later years he went back to related subjects. He looked at society in England in the 11th century, in which he expanded on this concept of interconnections between the traditions that had fed into English society. And he understood that in terms of what he called Germanic elements, the sort of Anglo-Saxon heritage, which went back a very long way, and this melded with a Roman French element that came with Norman conquest. So he was particularly interested in the period of melding between these two as it developed in the 1000s, the later 1000s, in the aftermath of the Norman conquest in 1066. He wrote about a whole range of subjects. He transformed not just how we understand villanage in its later medieval form, but some of the preconditions for how we get there. So in particular, he turned to this great chestnut of Anglo-Saxon scholarship, which was known as folkland. And in this quite short, but very, very important article from the end of the 19th century, he looked at what was understood by folkland, which had traditionally been thought of as land that was owned by the folk. It was a sort of public property. But in actual fact, that's not what it was at all. And we owe really to Vinogradov the observation that folkland, as the Anglo-Saxons understood it, was land that was held by individual people, but under what was called folk right, folk custom, a set of rules which was hardwired into society that were different from the way people owned land that had been given to them by charter. And if you had a document proving that you were the one that owned this land, you could do different things with it. And anything else you had that you'd inherited by other mechanisms was what they called folkland. I think that one of the enduring legacies of Maitland and Vinogradov in this late 19th century effervescence of scholarship that's been left to us is the way of looking at serfdom. I think that many of the questions that Vinogradov and Maitland were asking have been superseded. Nowadays, I don't think scholars would really approach this matter in terms of Germanic versus Roman influences on society, for instance. But the fact that it all has to be based in scrupulous and detailed knowledge of the archives, of Domesday Book, of manorial records and customs has become absolutely rooted into scholarship on the Middle Ages. Now it's completely indisputed that everyone who studies economic and social history needs to have a firm grasp of these plentiful medieval records. You can't just do it based on narratives. You can't just do it based on laws. You've got to do it based on the local records as well.